If you asked all the people leaving a horse race who they thought was going to win the race, you might find out that 20% of the people thought that number 17, the horse that did win the race, is the horse that they thought was going to win the race. But of course, you could compare those results to the bets placed prior to the race, and you might find out that only 10% of the people bet on number 17 to win. This discrepancy is caused by something called hindsight bias, and it's very important if you want to understand the world and economics. But it's even more important if you want to understand yourself and your personal finances, especially once you learn about its nasty little secret. Hindsight bias is the tendency for people to perceive past events as having been more predictable than they actually were. In our horse race example, more people thought they knew who was going to win the race once the race was over. This probably doesn't surprise you. We've spent our entire lives hearing things like, "I should have trusted my gut," or "I knew it all along," or "it seemed too obvious." That's because hindsight bias is relatively easy to detect in other people. But the nasty secret about it is that even though it's easy to see in other people, it's relatively hard to detect in ourselves. The human experience is very chaotic. There's a lot of things that are outside of our control. As humans, we have a hard time making sense of all that. No one wants to think that they got the dream job because they randomly interviewed with the boss after lunch when they were full and more agreeable. So we use hindsight bias to turn random events in the past into a more coherent story, a more predictable one. In this way, hindsight bias is a very effective coping mechanism to help us turn a chaotic past into a coherent story. In fact, you could argue that hindsight bias is our natural state. But this can have disastrous impacts on our own personal finances, especially when we're talking about investing. We're almost always trying to make a plan about some future chaotic outcome, like what the market's going to do. So most of us just fall back onto our own experiences, all of which are influenced by hindsight bias. In fact, much of the financial services industry is predicated on the idea that if we just had more information, we'd be able to make better predictions about financial outcomes. When in truth, some random event like COVID is going to throw the whole system into disarray. I see this most when we're talking about major economic downturns. Anybody who remembers back to the 2008 global financial crisis always has some story about a friend who dodged it or some expert who saw it coming. They may pull out newspaper articles or videos from some expert that predicted it all before it happened. What they don't focus on is the decades of very similar news coverage during great investment periods. Hindsight bias has turned a chaotic past into a coherent, predictable story. But if you're convinced that you can predict the next major downturn like someone did in the past, then you may become too aggressive, thinking that you'll be able to get out before it turns down. Or you may become too conservative, convinced that it's going to be in the next few months. When the truth is that the future is not as predictable as we remember the past to be because of hindsight bias. Don't fall into this trap. If you enjoyed the video, here's a very similar video about a kind of major shift in investment paradigms. Otherwise, stick around the channel for similar content. I'll talk to you soon.